So far, we've talked about several different perspectives of psychological sciences in the class. We've looked at the learning perspective, the biological perspective, the cognitive perspective, and now we're going to turn to look at the social and personality perspective. The social perspective recognizes that human thinking, feeling, and behavior doesn't operate in a vacuum, that we are enmeshed within lots of other organisms, and that enmeshment, that social environment, influences our thinking, feeling, and behaving in extremely significant ways. In this video, we're going to talk in a little bit of detail about attribution theory, theories of social influence, and finally, things like stereotyping and prejudice, love, attraction, and aggression. Social psychology recognizes that humans are attribution-making machines. What I mean by that is that every time we see another human, or really another animal, act in some way, we are constantly, either unconsciously or consciously, trying to explain why that organism is taking that behavior. Imagine you're walking through the Union and you see this guy tripping and spilling water everywhere. What kinds of attributions might you make for his behavior? In this unit, we talk about two different types of attributions: situational attributions and dispositional attributions. Dispositional attributions are when we say that someone's behavior is caused by something intrinsic or internal to themselves. For instance, this guy is tripping because he's clumsy. Something dispositional about him, some quality that persists across situations, is the cause for his apparent behavior. But we might also make situational attributions. In this case, something exterior to the person is responsible for the behavior. So we might say, this person is tripping because those cords are in his way. We make attributions based on the information that we have at the time of the behavior. This is really important to understand because it helps us realize when we're likely to make errors of attribution. In this instance below, I might jump to the conclusion that this person is clumsy because I can't see the cord or I don't have any other particular information that might indicate why he fell down. If I were the actor instead of the observer, for instance, if I were this guy who's falling down, I now have privileged access to lots of information about what might cause me to fall. I can certainly see and feel the cables, but I also know that I'm sleep deprived, that I have a headache, that my nice shoes were just waxed and that it's slippery, or that there's this attractive coworker next to me that I'm trying to get their attention in a really not a very good way. I have access to all of the situational factors that are contributing to that behavior. No observer, no matter how keen, could have access to all of those situational causes. What this means is that when we observe someone else's behavior, we tend to overestimate the dispositional contribution to that behavior and underestimate the situational contribution to that behavior. In other words, when we see someone fall down, we tend to think they're clumsy rather than to make a situational attribution that something tripped them. We call this the fundamental attribution error because it happens so frequently and it's foundational to understanding some of the theory in social psychology. Sometimes when we're making attributions about our own behavior, we might make the opposite mistake. Since now we have privileged access to all of the situational influences going into our behavior, we might discount the more dispositional influences in our behavior. We will favor situational attributions to dispositional attributions when those dispositional attributions wouldn't be particularly flattering. Now this is all pretty easy to understand when we're thinking about one activity, one guy slipping and falling. But human behavior is much more complicated than that. For example, let's say a romantic partner is kind of mean to you. How might you attribute that behavior? The way in which you attribute that behavior can have a significant impact on the outcome of that conflict. So it's really important to understand our biases in how we might attribute different people's behavior. Social psychologists are also interested in attitudes. Attitude is a commonly misunderstood word. What we mean in psychology is a general positive or negative predisposition towards some object or group or person. You can have an attitude towards just about anything, but attitudes must always be towards something. Much like a correlation coefficient, attitudes have both a valence and a strength. You can have a relatively strong positive attitude towards something, a weak positive attitude, or negative attitudes of varying strength. What's interesting to me about attitudes is that they're not very good predictors of behavior. If I know whether or not you like exercise, that doesn't actually tell me a whole lot about whether or not you actually exercise. And remember, one of psychology's goals is prediction. So if attitudes don't help us predict behavior, then what value are they? We can understand the relevance of attitudes by looking at their relationship with behavior. Attitudes and behavior have a cyclical or sort of symbiotic relationship where attitudes predispose us towards certain behaviors, and then those behaviors reinforce or change the attitudes with which they're associated. This feedback loop is really important. Let's say, for instance, that I have an attitude that I kind of like soccer, and as a result, that attitude drives me to participate in a community rec league. Now, I'm spending lots of my time and energy preparing for soccer and playing soccer, and that behavior is going to feed back and strengthen my attitude. Now I like soccer more than I did when I first started. That stronger attitude is going to promote more behaviors that may further strengthen that attitude. What's particularly interesting is when these attitudes and behaviors are in conflict. We call this cognitive dissonance, and Leon Festinger was one of the original researchers who demonstrated the power of this particular theory. The experiment demonstrated here is where students entered an experiment having the pre-existing attitude that tuition at school was too high. They were then asked, as part of the experiment, to write a detailed essay from the school's perspective describing why tuition might need to be raised. At the end of the exercise, we found that even though people were instructed to make this counter-argument, and they knew they were instructed to make the counter-argument, their attitudes shifted towards their behavior. That is, their attitudes shifted towards the argument that they had written out. In literally thousands of studies over the last 50 years, we've discovered that when attitudes and behavior are in conflict, we experience discomfort. And that's psychological discomfort as well as physiological discomfort. We experience stress. We're motivated by that distress to attempt to reduce that dissonance, to make our behaviors and our attitudes more consistent. Since it is so frequently easier to change an attitude than it is to change a behavior, our attitudes tend to follow our behaviors in this instance. If you want to change your attitude about something, one of the most powerful ways to do it is to change your behavior. Want to be a morning person? Set an alarm and force yourself to get up early. After a few weeks, your attitude might shift to follow your behavior. In short, the idea of fake it till you make it has some empirical backing. I don't think any introductory psychology course is complete without a discussion of 3 seminal studies in social influence. We are social animals, and we get a tremendous amount of information from our environment and from other organisms in our environment. This is remarkably adaptive. We talked a little bit in the reading section on conformity and how conformity often has sort of a negative connotation. However, conformity is incredibly valuable in many instances. Let's say you're walking down the street and suddenly everyone around you starts ducking and hitting the ground. Conforming in that instance, behaving without any information similar to a way others are behaving, could be potentially very valuable. They may have some privileged information that you don't have, and you might benefit from mimicking their behavior. Conformity can, of course, be very detrimental. When a group, for instance, is headed down a path that's detrimental, conforming to that path simply because others are on it could be detrimental to the self or to the group. Solomon Asch's studies demonstrate the power of conformity pressure. Participants were invited into a room with 7 other Confederates. They were always given the number 6 slot, and then an experimenter came in and showed them a series of lines. On one card was presented the standard line, a line of a certain length. On the other card was presented 3 options. The group's goal was to decide individually and publicly which of the lines on the second card most closely matched the length of the standard line. As you can see with the stimuli in your textbook, this was a pretty clear and apparent decision. But as soon as the answers began, starting with number 1, remember these are Confederates or people who are in on the experiment, began answering incorrectly. You can see the expression on number 6's face here, the participant, who's confused. He's doubting his own vision as he hears everyone else making what he sees to be the wrong decision. People overwhelmingly conformed in this situation. While certainly some resisted 100% of the time, most, during the first couple of trials, might voice some dissent. but would quickly conform. Ash did a variety of follow-up experiments, and if you're interested in conformity, I urge you to look them up. He found the variety of factors that increase and decrease conformity. One thing that I will mention is that all it took to break the power of conformity was for there to be one other person who was willing to dissent and go against the group. This demonstrates that the power of one solitary dissenting voice can really help in situations where conformity is a problem. Conformity is when we change our perceptions, our attitudes, or our beliefs to be in line with the group in which we're embedded. Obedience is when we behave according to some direct command. The second of the 3 studies on social influence that I want you to understand is the Milgram study. In the wake of World War II, Stanley Milgram was fascinated and horrified by the extent to which German soldiers were willing to obey in the annihilation and genocide of those they called undesirables. Milgram's hypothesis was that Germans were a uniquely obedient people, so he set out to collect some baseline data on obedience here in the United States, and then planned to go to Germany to demonstrate how much more obedient the German people were. In Milgram's study, participants were invited to the lab and were told that they would be participating in a learning study. They were told that they would either be the teacher or the learner, and then they were allowed to draw their role out of a hat. The participant always drew the teacher role because a research confederate served as the learner. The learner was situated behind a wall and was hooked up to an electric shock machine. The teacher then helped them learn a list of word pairings. Then, the teacher was instructed to test the learner on these word pairings. They were also instructed that every time the learner made a mistake, they were supposed to flip the next switch on the shock generator machine next to them. Over time, the learner expressed more and more distress at the electric shocks, eventually asking to be released, kicking the wall, describing heart symptoms, and then failing to respond to repeated shocks. During this time, anytime the teacher, remember the participant, expressed any concern or wished to stop, the researcher, who was in the room watching as a figure of authority, would say, "The experiment requires you to continue. Please continue," without giving any more direction or information to the teacher. Remember, Milgram was expecting that most people wouldn't go very far in the United States, and that would protest and quit and storm out. They weren't being held there, they weren't being chained to the chair, they were just being told the experiment requires you to continue, by an authority figure in a lab coat sitting near them. In what stunned Milgram and still stuns many today, just about 2/3 of the participants went all the way to 450 volts, labeled XXX Danger Extreme Shock on the shock generator, beyond the point where the learner was no longer responding, and to the point where they might reasonably assume that this person had been injured badly. That is, 2/3 of the people who went into that room for a research study were willing to injure another human being because they were instructed to do so. Milgram's study has obvious ethical concerns, but more ethical replications of the study have been conducted and have found similar results over the last 40 or 50 years. We, like other social animals, respond to power and hierarchy, and Milgram helps us understand how normal, rational people can make really bad choices. Understanding the mechanisms involved here can help us resist those instances where obedience can be detrimental. The third and final study I'll discuss for social influence is the Zimbardo prison study that describes social role theory. Zimbardo's idea, and an idea that we now very well understand, is that we tend to play social roles and perform social scripts when we're in a role that we understand well. Zimbardo tested this social role theory by randomly assigning participants to be either a prison guard or a prison inmate in his simulated prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. The guards were given a khaki pseudo-uniform, reflective sunglasses, and a baton. The inmates went through the arrest process thanks to the local police department, and were brought down and given a smock to wear, given a number for identification, and placed in cells. The inmates wore chains around their ankles but were not locked, and the doors had bars but were also not locked. Inmates could leave at any time. Zimbardo's study was expected to be a lengthy study to look at how the individuals adopted these roles over time. In fact, the study was shut down after only a few days, as both the guards and inmates surprisingly quickly and fiercely adopted their roles, to the point where prisoners were undergoing a hunger strike and guards were building new and unique ways to punish those prisoners, like building solitary isolation, forcing them to clean latrines, and other such things that they were not instructed to do. What fascinates me most about this study is that Zimbardo himself typifies the social role theory that he was trying to demonstrate. He took on the role of the warden, and as a result, he was too close to the study to see the horrifying ethical implications that were playing out in front of him. In fact, it took one of his graduate students returning from a trip and seeing what was playing out for him to recognize the problem and cancel the study early. There's a wonderful documentary called Quiet Rage about Zimbardo's study, and Zimbardo has a book called The Lucifer Effect, all about the problem of evil that he looks at from this social role theory lens. You might have recognized this in your own life when you've taken on a new job, or you've become a college student, or you've moved into some other role that has a set of specific behaviors that surround it. You tend to adopt attitudes and behaviors that fit that role. You tend to become whatever it is you are. No discussion of social is complete without discussing how these different groups can interact with one another, or social relationships. What interests me is how so many intergroup relations are contentious, strained, or even violent. There are several theories to help understand why we might have strained intergroup relations, like prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. One such theory is social identity theory, the idea that we derive some of our self-identity from our group, and that threats to that group's values or security are taken very harshly, and that we tend to turn against groups that represent some kind of threat to our group. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the long arc of history bends towards justice. And we tend to see that, at least in American society. We tend to identify some stigmatized group and then make prejudice against that group increasingly socially proscribed. That is, we don't allow people to outwardly express negative attitudes towards that particular target group. And remember what we just talked about, that attitudes tend to follow behavior. If suddenly people are unallowed to discuss those attitudes and to express that prejudice openly and express that prejudice through discriminatory behaviors, those attitudes will tend to follow that behavior and people will develop more egalitarian attitudes. This has been the case with a variety of different groups over the last 50 and 60 years in American history. I'm personally interested in prejudice towards atheists. The reason I'm interested in this is that prejudice towards atheists is the most widely accepted prejudice in the United States, and tolerance for atheists has not grown nearly as much as tolerance towards any other group in the United States, as indicated by these Gallup data demonstrated here. Will Gervais, myself, and several other researchers argue that this is because people connect moral behavior to a belief in a higher power. If you're interested in this research, watch the bonus video below. There's much research in social psychology on attraction and love. Students are often interested in what the predictors of attraction are. And interestingly, physical attractiveness is a strong predictor of attraction. But there are others that are also very powerful. One of the most interesting to me is propinquity or proximity. We tend to be attracted to things that we see frequently, that we're exposed to often. One interesting study of this effect is who is most liked in an apartment complex. Many of you may live in one. The people who are most liked by others in the complex are those who are seen most frequently, those by the mailbox, and those at the bottom and top of the staircase. So if you're interested in someone and you want to increase their attractiveness for you, it's good to spend time near one another. But even better would be to spend time near one another doing some activity that you both enjoy, because the third strongest predictor of attraction is similarity. We talked about this in one of the first units, that similarity is one of the greatest predictors of attraction, and most importantly, it's one of the greatest predictors of long-term stability of a relationship. People tend to be attracted to those who have similar attitudes, similar interests, and similar behaviors. So much so that some studies indicate that mirroring someone's posture, cadence, or gestures can have an impact on their first impression. Attraction is perhaps the easier part to measure of this equation of attraction and love. And the text describes several theories of love, but I really enjoy the tripartite theory that demonstrates how love develops over the course of a relationship. Another area of social psychology is the study of aggression. Aggression is also a tricky concept to understand. In psychology, when we talk about aggression, what we mean is behavior that is intended to harm or hurt another. There are two types of aggression that we distinguish between. Hostile aggression, which is aggression for its own end. We just want to destroy something. And instrumental aggression, which is aggression to get some other non-aggressive goal. In the case of roller derby here, what we're seeing is instrumental aggression. That blocker is attempting to knock that jammer down instrumentally in order to prevent her from scoring points. If they weren't playing a game and that woman just creamed the other one, that may be hostile aggression, aggression for its own end. Aggression is a quality that is learned just like anything else. The Bandura studies that we talked about previously demonstrate how aggression might be learned, and I know that many of you, through your psychology and action assignments, have indicated an interest in violence in video games. Perhaps unfortunately, the data indicate that playing video games can have a short-term increase in the probability of aggressive behavior or aggressive responses to frustration. But understanding that empirical relationship can help us diffuse it, and there are lots of different ways to do that. If you're interested in the subject, Craig Anderson has a series of meta-analyses that describe the state of the research on video games and violence. Finally, I wanted to talk about helping behavior, because it's also an area of research of my own. Helping is a powerful but potentially costly behavior, because we give our resources to benefit something else without necessarily any expectation of return. Some very interesting data on helping indicates that the presence of others might actually decrease our probability of helping someone else in need. This so-called bystander effect gets in the way of our assumption of responsibility for someone else's need. In one classic study, participants were paired up with partners over an intercom system and were led to believe that either several other people were involved in the phone call or only one other person was involved in the phone call. Then, the person they were talking to experienced a seizure. Those who believed they were alone overwhelmingly left the room and went to find someone to get help. Those who believed they were on a call with several other people often did not respond because they did not assume responsibility and assume that someone else will act. Be aware of the bystander effect. These are the steps that are necessary in order to attempt to help someone. Noticing the incident, recognizing it's an emergency, and most importantly, taking responsibility in those instances. Social psychology is focused on understanding how interactions with others influence who we are, the self, and our behavior. I hope you've enjoyed this section, and I'm looking forward to your expressions of how the social world influences you.